Hello and welcome to this video about the Cold War. So this video isn't going to give you the full narrative overview, it's going to concentrate on different categories and how to think about organising information, and mainly it's going to talk through some of the reasons for changes. So you can see that we've used two different colours mainly on this timeline. We've got red phases and green phases. The red phases are where the tensions between the two countries, the USA and the USSR, are at their worst, so periods of Cold War. And then the green events are periods of détente, of where the relationship has and the tension has relaxed. And then the final phase in green is the events leading to the end of Cold War. So again, where the relationship is better. We're going to talk through some of the key reasons for change. So in an exam, if we were asked to explain, we'd be given reasons. So the first set of reasons we're going to talk through are the reasons for the Cold War developing in the first place. Now, through World War II, the USSR and the USA had been allies, but they'd been friends in a kind of a tentative sense. They're not natural allies, and the reason why they'd been allied together on the same side in the war was because of their common enemy, that being Nazi Germany. However, come 1945, with the defeat of Nazi Germany, they didn't have that need to cooperate anymore. So the loss of their common enemy meant that their relationship was going to revert to being a more negative one anyway. Add in then the next reason of having opposing political systems, the USA being capitalist and the USSR being communist, and then the US fear of communism and the domino theory, the idea that they didn't want communism to spread from one country to the next, like a line of dominoes falling. And what you get from that is the Truman Doctrine. So the fear of the spread of communism develops the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment, the active foreign policy of the USA to stop the spread of communism. Now, that opposing stance is clearly going to add tensions to the relationship between the USA and the USSR. The policy of containment develops then with the Marshall Plan and the active events in trying to support Eastern European countries to resist a communist revolution in their country. That's going to add tensions to the relationship even more. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences toward the end of World War II led to the division of Germany into 4 zones, which later kind of amalgamated into 2 separate parts, with the USSR communist zone in the east and the more capitalist zones under control of France, Great Britain, and the USA in the west. So what we get is a divided Europe. Winston Churchill talked in 1946 in his famous speech of an Iron Curtain and the division of Europe. Europe's been separated into 2 teams or camps with their opposing political systems and the growing tensions between the 2 superpowers of the USA and the USSR. So all of this comes together to provide the conditions for a Cold War. And then you get the first set of events in red on this timeline, which are leading to the tensions getting worse and worse and worse till we reach the absolute crunch point of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, that was the closest that the world had gotten to nuclear war at that point. And that led to a real sobering effect. The threat of nuclear war and how close the world had gotten with this idea of brinkmanship leads to an active change in approach. And this gives us a period of time known as détente. So if we're thinking about reasons why that change happened, why we went from Cold War to détente, the first reason we could talk about was the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the sobering effect that had. That gives us a trigger for change, or a catalyst for change and improved relations. So that meant that telephone lines were set up between the Kremlin and Washington DC, for example, so that communication between the 2 leaders could be much more efficient and hopefully more positive. There was motivation on both sides as well to decrease defence spending, so there's an economic reason for détente. The USA also wanted to use détente as a way of improving the situation in Vietnam. So the impact of the disastrous US involvement in Vietnam meant that they needed the USSR more on their side. This was the idea of linkage. If the USA could be better friends, if you like, with the USSR, then the USSR might use their influence with their allies North Vietnam in order to bring the Vietnamese War to a quicker end. The USSR also had motivations for wanting a more positive relationship with the USA because they didn't want the USA and the Chinese to develop a relationship at their expense. So basically, after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, it suits both sides to have a more positive relationship. That leads us to a lot of different treaties and discussions around limiting nuclear weapons and being more transparent about testing, and the tension eases. However, we then get to our second phase of Cold War, the Second Cold War, prompted in 1979 by the invasion of Afghanistan by the USSR. So the reason for the Second Cold War can primarily be put down to the USSR's invasion of Afghanistan. This leads, from the USA's point of view, to the Carter Doctrine, which is a really firm stance against the USSR, and the relationship breaks down once again. This means that there are major restrictions over the trade of grain. There's a boycott of the Olympic Games, and probably most importantly in terms of nuclear weapons, the SALT II treaty is not ratified by the USA. However, from the mid-1980s onwards, the relationship starts to get more positive again. So if we're then looking for reasons for the end of Cold War, this will give you an idea of a summary. In 1985, the USSR leader changes and we have Gorbachev in power. Now, he was motivated, partly through financial reasons, to make reforms within the USSR, and his two key reforms were perestroika and glasnost. What this does is eases international tensions, because he wanted the USA in particular to see that the USSR was making steps to reform themselves, and so that they weren't seen as such an enemy. However, what this also leads to is the ultimate downfall and the collapse of the USSR. Gorbachev developed the Sinatra Doctrine, and this was the idea that countries within the USSR could have more independence, if you like, in the way that they were ruled, and that there would be less involvement from the government, the central government in the USSR. Gorbachev had hoped that this would improve relationships within the USSR, but the actual outcome was that once they'd started to make their own reforms and their own independence, it kind of set in motion a chain of events that Gorbachev couldn't overly control. And different countries within the USSR wanted to break away and become independent. So with that process happening and the huge changes in the political and geographical areas of Eastern Europe, it means that ultimately the USSR collapses. And by 1991, there's only one superpower left. You can't have a Cold War with only one superpower. So by that point, with the collapse of the USSR, for financial reasons and for linking to these internal reforms of Gorbachev, we reach the end of the Cold War by 1991.